Michael Ostrolenk here with Jonathan Bydlak. He is the president for the Institute for Spending Reform. How you doing, Jonathan?
Good. Thanks for having me, Michael.
That's great to see you. You have a great new project. It's called A Guide for a Strong America. I hold it in my hand presently. It's about spending reform at the Pentagon, a very important fiscal conservative approach. We want a very strong military, but we want to be fiscally sound in how we approach that kind of spending. You do a great job in your report, kind of breaking things down. Before we kind of jump into the various pieces of the report, tell us why you did the report in the first place.
Sure. So, back in the day, I used to be a political consultant, I guess. I wore that cap, and I obviously am conservative and libertarian myself, and I used to always think that in many ways, the sort of the litmus test, if you will, of who really walks the walk when it comes to being fiscally conservative are really those people who are willing to apply the same principles to all areas of government. And I think, we have this situation in Washington where, we have some on the left who say, well, we can't touch entitlement spending, and we oftentimes have some on the right who say, well, we can't look at Pentagon spending. And the reality is, we have waste in all of these areas. We have programs that we shouldn't necessarily have. And so I think it's really important, particularly in the current political environment, to really show and explain to conservatives that it's consistent with fiscally conservative principles to look at the Pentagon too, which as we know, the Pentagon is the largest portion of the discretionary budget. And, we now have, of course, an audit of the Pentagon in the works. And so I think there's a lot of movement and credit to President Trump's leadership and David Norquist's leadership. And so I think it's worth kind of thinking about, what are all of these ideas that are out there? Because one of the frustrations we've had is that, we work with many different groups all the time, and everyone kind of has their favorite sort of reform proposal, on not just on Pentagon issues, but on all sorts of issues. And we realized there was no sort of central clearinghouse for all of these ideas. And that's kind of what motivated the, sort of looking at Pentagon spending specifically, but also, this project, Guide for a Strong America, as well.
Awesome. So your report is broken down into at least 5 sections. You look at acquisition, you look at VA services, you look at personnel, base and infrastructure, and foreign policy. So what I like to do is kind of tease the listening and viewing audience, because I do want them to go and actually read the report. I think it's really important that they see the totality of what you guys have done. But maybe we could break down each one and just give 1 or 2 examples of the reforms that you'd like to see implemented that would both save us money as taxpayers and ensure that the Pentagon is spending our money well and the military has provided the equipment, the training, and the manpower that it actually needs. Why don't we start with acquisition?
Yeah, well, and I think it's probably worth talking a little bit just up front about, where all these ideas come from.
Sure.
Because, these ideas, frankly, aren't even ours. We cobbled these together from everything from, reports from the GAO and the Congressional Budget Office, from, other sort of outside taxpayer watchdog groups like ourselves, from members of Congress, generally conservative and Republican members of Congress. And so, these are ideas that have sort of been out there in one form or another for a very long time in some cases. And, I think it's in total, I want to say it's 84, 85 ideas across these different subject areas. And, that was sort of the thing that we realized up front is that, there's all the, the Pentagon does a lot. And there's a lot of different ways to sort of, get more responsible levels of Pentagon spending. And so, I think our first task was sort of, okay, well, there's all these ideas, we cobble them all together, but how do we really think about them? And so that was, what motivated those 5 or 6 areas that you mentioned. More directly to your question, a lot of these ideas too, they run the gamut. Some of these are really big, structural reforms that could save, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, potentially even, who knows? In many cases, we don't even know necessarily how much savings could come from particular ideas, and we use the sort of the best estimates that we could get. And some of these are smaller reforms, that might save $1 million here or $1 million there, and of course, as former U.S. Senator Tom Coburn was always fond of saying, you get to this large national debt, you get to these large levels of spending by looking at all of these individual items and sort of aggregating them up. And so, when you look at acquisitions, for example, right, you're going to have things that could be a really big savings, like, canceling the LCS, for example, which is something that a lot of groups talk about, and we know has sort of been ridden with cost overruns, and so you've got that potentially, I think the savings is something like $1 billion or more that could be saved just from going and canceling the LCS. But there are a whole host of other ideas. There are times where taxpayers get charged for mistakes by shipbuilders. And so shipbuilders make a mistake when they're building a ship, and in executing their contract with, say, the Navy. And taxpayers end up on the hook for that.
Yeah.
Well, there's no reason that taxpayers need to be on the hook for that. Now, is that the reason why we have waste at the Pentagon, or sort of is that sort of what accounts for the Pentagon's whole budget? Of course not. But a small change like that, right, is a potentially easy to fix idea, and something that we should consider. And it's an easier lift than, say, maybe canceling the LCS, or of course everyone's favorite example, talking about the F-35. And so we've tried to, in this case too, talk about these ideas in terms of what is politically reasonable and feasible, and which is another big important thing. I mean, you can talk about end this agency or end this program, and sometimes that's really difficult. But oftentimes there are a lot of smaller reforms that you make a few of those and they add up to really big savings. So those are just a couple of examples in the acquisition space. We also look at things like, sorry.
Yeah, let me just speak real quickly to the you mentioned the LCS, Littoral Combat Ship.
Mm-hmm.
The military itself acknowledged that it will only work in passive environments. So a warship that only works in passive environments is a problem. And I believe McCain, head of SASC at this moment in time, we're now May of 2018, has acknowledged the troubles with the LCS. So it's not just groups on the outside looking in saying this is a problem. The government itself has acknowledged that there are problems here in this case.
That's exactly right. And like I said, I mean, a lot of these ideas, I mean, we didn't just go and pull these ideas out of thin air.
Yeah.
I mean, these are suggestions that are coming from, and in many cases have been made for many years by the CBO, by GAO, by internal watchdogs and stuff, or frankly even the Pentagon. I mean, as we know, a lot of times we have programs that continue to be funded by Congress when our generals say we don't need these various programs. And so it's kind of this odd situation where you have people in government who are saying we don't need this. You have internal government watchdogs saying we shouldn't be funding, external government watchdogs saying we shouldn't be funding this, and Congress just continues to do so. So, again, these are many ideas that fit in that bucket, unfortunately.
You did mention the F-35, and that's my bugaboo, so I'd be remiss not to point out that it's going to, according to Taxpayers for Common Sense, over $1 trillion, actually maybe $1.5 trillion over its lifetime. 3 versions. One version was supposed to be combat operational by 2008. It's now 2018. Lots of problems with that program, but I think you made a really good point. There are large programs like that which are problematic. Congress continues to fund them, although a lot of people internal to the government and external to the government keep pointing them out. But you also pointed out that these big programs are a problem, but also there's smaller programs that you might call low-hanging fruit. That might be easier to go after because they don't have such a large constituency. Like the F-35 is, various parts are built all over the country, so there's political interest in keeping the jobs programs alive. So just in terms of some of the low-hanging fruit, can you give me another example besides shipbuilding?
Yeah, I mean, another great example that is probably my favorite was there was actually a case where they basically switched the controllers that they were using in a particular submarine. And these sort of proprietary controllers that the Navy had sort of started using I think it was something like $35,000 per controller. They basically ended up switching to an Xbox-style controller, which cost something more on the order of $35 per submarine. So again, that's something that is that the cause of the size of the Pentagon's budget? Of course not. But the reality is that we have examples examples like this all the time that are just common sense reforms that, frankly, I mean, regardless of your ideological perspective, it just makes sense to do these. And frankly, it makes us, it ends up resulting in a stronger national defense to the degree that we're not wasting resources on things that we shouldn't be wasting them on. And so that's just another example, right?
Yeah.
And you can tick through the list of various ideas like this. And I should say that, a big motivation for this project too is that, we don't sort of view this as, hey, this is a comprehensive plan for how to modify the way the Pentagon is operating. What we're saying is these are options that are out there. They're options that have been endorsed in one way or another by government agencies or by conservative members of Congress. And you don't have to agree with all of them, but let's sort of build coalitions around those ideas where it makes sense to implement these reforms, and then let's go to them. I mean, there are a lot of places to start.
So let's actually go to another issue area that you discuss in your report that actually has strong support for, and it was fascinating to watch it fail this last time around. And that's BRAC. You talk about base and infrastructure reforms. BRAC fits into that, and it's amazing because the Department of Defense supports BRAC. A lot of the outside groups for years have supported BRAC. And I believe the Trump administration actually released a statement of principles that they supported BRAC at the time. And yet Congress kept that out of the amendment process, and it failed. Talk a little bit about some of the base and infrastructure reforms that you would support, or that you supported in your report.
Yeah, and so I should say, make another point here, which is that, with all of these ideas, we sort of view them as it's a clearinghouse of ideas. And so, it's not even necessarily that we as an organization endorse all of them, or that, some of these ideas may conflict with one another, or overlap, or what have you. But in the case of BRAC, right? I mean, you have estimated savings of, I think it's $2 billion annually. For over a 10-year window, so that could very well potentially be part of the solution of reining in some of the excessive levels of Pentagon spending. But there are other. I mean, there are really specific reforms, right? I mean, you can get things like installing diesel microgrids can save something like eight or 10 or I think even more. It might even be $20 million a year. So you have things like that. There are underutilized base facilities that could potentially be used in more effective ways, and just by sort of realigning the way resources are allocated, could end up making operations more efficient and ultimately resulting in lower costs per year. There's various different control networks that can be sort of shared with one another. Oftentimes you have different programs at the Pentagon where one system is built for one specific purpose, another system is built for another specific purpose, but actually you can oftentimes, utilize these systems to accomplish multiple purposes, and you don't necessarily need to go and invest and build, multiple proprietary systems for every little program. So there are things like that too that can be from an infrastructure standpoint too, also be very beneficial. So there's a lot of these, and then of course there's big ticket items too, right? Like not just looking at domestic bases, but looking at foreign bases and our footprint overseas, and what should that look like relative to our expected threats? And obviously, again, that's a potentially bigger lift, but it's of course something that fits into this bases and infrastructure bucket.
Another area that you guys explore is VA services, and obviously that's been in the news a lot recently. The failure of the VA to serve, former combat veterans in a useful way. What are some of the VA reforms that you include in your report?
Yeah. So I mean, again, there's this ranges from the almost trivial or the small things like reforming the VA's mailing system, and the way that they use these very outdated systems that result in human error and end up driving up costs, and they spend millions of dollars on just sending out pieces of mail, and so just changing the way that they send mail out could end up having millions of dollars of savings a year. Then you have things that are, really, again, really big ticket items that a lot of us talk about all the time, like reforming TRICARE for Life, for example, and some of the entitlement programs, which, of course, this is a problem that affects not just the Pentagon, but really it affects a lot of the entitlement programs that we have at the federal level. So you have things like that. You have unemployability benefits that end up being paid out to people who are no longer of working age. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. I think the savings there is something like close to $40 billion over a 10-year time period. So it's not a small chunk of change. So there are a lot of these kind of things that can have, I think, a pretty significant spending impact. And some of these, of course, don't necessarily just fit strictly into the Pentagon's discretionary budget either, right? I mean, some of these are services that are related to entitlement programs that are essentially on autopilot, just like all the other entitlement programs that we have. So those are just a few ideas that fit into the VA services area.
Another area that you guys talk about is personnel.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the reforms that you would see there?
Yeah, well, so, and this one isn't necessarily, I think we have it lumped in one of the other areas, but, we talk about sort of Pentagon restructuring at a big level too. And my personal favorite on this list is sort of ending the idea of spend it or lose it. And sort of these budgetary practices that we have that exist. We have, and of course, again, this is not unique to Pentagon spending. The Department of State is probably the most well-known example. But, we have people who are given budgets, and the way that we incentivize people to manage those budgets is basically spend all your money so you can make sure to get that appropriation the coming year, even if you don't need all of that money for the programs that you're overseeing. But of course, we don't have people. For example, it would be great if people were able to get a bonus for saving money, rather than having to be incentivized to spend that money. So, and that's something that I'm sure you hear this all the time. When you talk to members of the armed services or anyone who has really served, that issue comes up all the time. This idea of look, like we are spending money when they know themselves that they don't need to be spending it on a lot of these items. Personnel, I mean, there's a whole, this is a whole number of things, right? I mean, again, looking at things like, another favorite of mine is spending less on military bands. We have all of these events and we have military bands that go to them. Well, those are incredibly expensive. So there's estimates, that, we could save over $1 billion just by reducing how frequently we use military bands at various events. And again, we may ultimately that's something that's a worthwhile expense, or that it's something that we can't do without. But we should be having these kinds of discussions, and we should be thinking about spending like that relative to something else that might be very relevant to our national defense needs in addressing the threats that we have. But so there are all sorts of other, incentive, new incentive pay programs, for example, that could end up getting us better outcomes and also cutting the costs that we have with respect to personnel. There's all sorts of course, civilian bureaucratic positions within DoD, and there's been a lot of research talking about sort of the increase in personnel costs being driven not by the size of the force, but by the actual bureaucrats that we have within the administration or within the department. And so that's just another idea, right? And then looking at there are very specific ideas. So it's not just, I think sometimes when you talk about personnel, some people say, oh well, does that just mean cutting troop pay? But of course, troop pay is not at all what is driving the vast majority of spending we have at the Pentagon. It's not even the majority of the problem with the personnel area specifically. So anyway, those are just a couple of ideas, but and there are many that fit into the personnel bucket.
Another area that you talk about is foreign policy. You kind of already talked about BRAC. We're doing a BRAC in terms of foreign bases abroad. What other areas in foreign policy, as a teaser, because we want people to go check out your report, A Guide for a Strong America, do you talk about in terms of possible reforms to both save the taxpayer money and ensure we have a strong military?
Sure. So, there are some ideas here, right, that have been talked about by many before. Defunding or reducing funding to the United Nations, right? That's something that many Republicans have supported for a long time. It's something the president, I believe, has been supportive of. There's the questions of foreign aid and whether or not we should be sending as much foreign aid as we do to many countries that we do. There are ideas that are potentially more revolutionary. I mean, there's been, calls to privatize, parts of the war, maybe all of the current war in Afghanistan. So even if again, we weren't pulling out of Afghanistan, there are ways to engage in that area in a much more cost-effective way. In fact, that's something that members of the Trump White House have proposed, which is a pretty, unprecedented plan. Now, whether or not that particular idea is a good one or not, again, it's just we should be having these kinds of debates, and we should be having those debates relative to all of these different priorities that we're talking about. I'm fond of saying that sometimes we have, I think politicians sort of look at themselves as as if they're Santa Claus and they can kind of give something away to everyone, rather than thinking about themselves, like an economist might, and realizing that resources are finite. With respect to the federal government, we have to, you have to weigh spending at the Pentagon relative to other areas of the government, but you also have to weigh spending, various types of spending within the Pentagon relative to one another. And so, you might ultimately think that, having military bands at all sorts of events is a great idea, but does it make sense to spend that money there when we might want to go and spend it on something else that would have a more direct, national security impact? So, but in the foreign policy realm, obviously this tends to fit, more of these bigger ideas, right? Rethinking our role in the world, not just with respect to foreign aid, but also, troop footprints in Europe. Obviously this is something that's relevant now that we're having a debate publicly about, our footprint on the Korean Peninsula. So all of these sorts of ideas, when we talk about them, we focus, rightfully so, I think, on sort of the national security implications and whether they make sense from that standpoint. But there's also a very important cost, side of these discussions that should be had too, and we should be thinking about our strategy in that context. As we know, we've had many members within the military who are very concerned about the national debt. Right. Of course, the famous quote, that the national debt is the greatest threat to our national security. You don't necessarily even need to buy into that viewpoint to recognize that it is a concern over the long term that can ultimately impact our ability to defend ourselves and allies in other areas of the world. And so, if we have to think about these considerations now before, of course, they get out of control to the point that they can't handle.
Amen, Jonathan. So where can folks learn more about the Institute for Spending Reform, generally, and more specifically your report, A Guide for a Strong America?
Sure, yeah. So our website is just spendingreform.org. So pretty straightforward, although I almost botched it myself. And the Guide for a Strong America is just at strongamericaguide.org. And of course, if you Google Guide for a Strong America, I think it'll be one of the first things that comes up. But and there's a written version, sort of PDF that you can download and thumb through. But of course, the site itself is also meant as a dynamic resource that, as new ideas come out from various sources, we can kind of keep that list always fresh and up to date. And so, if your viewers have suggestions on ideas that we may not have included or that you think should be included, we're all ears on that front. We're happy to go and sort of keep this as a constant dynamic resource. And I think it's really important for a number of audiences too, just to highlight this for 1 second. Obviously policymakers and the staff in the executive branch and congressional offices are important, but also just as a resource for the general public to kind of know what their money is ultimately being spent on. For members of the press to be able to go and sort of report accurately on these various programs. And so, it's a great dynamic resource beyond just sort of the printed out report. Right. And, very much would encourage people to check it out. So it's just, again, strongamericaguide.org, and our website is spendingreform.org.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. Great to see you, man.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it was awesome.